Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to this time a rainy Central European time zone. Although I am still extremely tired, I'm having a busy season at work currently. I can't complain since I do enjoy my work, unlike unfortunately many people in this world, but it still tires me out. It's particularly mentally taxing. But in any case, we are going to start with the course. The first ones are 30 seconds, as always, which actually, to be honest, I would have been happy with this at 25 seconds. Of course, it seems that the special sessions are psychologically easier. There is perhaps there is less to draw, or perhaps the topics are somehow easier to break down and formalize into discrete sort of rough drawing. Whatever the reason is, it just feels easier to gesture draw faces, hands, feet than it does entire bodies. I'm sure that if you actually did want to make a huge effort, you could spend an awful lot of time drawing a single foot, but it just seems less necessary than it does for the entire body. I don't remember if I've told you about this, grandpa, but when I was an art model as a student, there was this mm, old, I don't know how old, in his 60s, maybe 70s, old, but I don't think ancient, um, student, so to say, at the gesture drawing course where I worked, who was an amazing speed painter. He did his gesture drawings with a brush and some ink, and he would not sketch, he would not draw in any outlines. What he did was draw in the shadows. So he would lay 10, 15 strokes on the paper, and he would have an amazing, not not really a finished drawing, of course, but he did an amazing job in just a few seconds. Certainly a better job, both on as a question of anatomy. I don't remember noticing him making any sort of identifiable mistakes. I'm sure he stylized something, but nothing that I would have identified as a mistake. And in an amazingly short amount of time. Of course, the other students would ask him how he manages to do it. Unfortunately, he didn't really have an answer to that. He could just say that he's been doing it for decades by now, so he's just learned it over time. And I imagine that that is the case. He had been at it for decades, had learned something, but unfortunately for the others, or of course it could be that he was able to conceptualize what he was doing, but just didn't want to work as a teacher. We interestingly see the would have seen the height difference of the inner and outer ankle bones had I finished that more or less on time, that we would have been able to see it, or well, I was able to see it, of course, but that you would have been able to see it. Um, Speaking out of memory, I can't really remember whether it is the inside or the outside bone of the fore of the lower leg that is longer. They are asymmetric. Now I see a person from behind once again, and I can see that it is in fact the outer bone that is longer. The outer bone is of course also the more gracile of the bones. It stays on the outside the entire way through and is in many ways comparable to the outer bone of the forearm as well. So here we see the bone runs from here to here, whereas the long bone makes a slight curve like that. This appears to be a woman. She has a gracile foot and has a tattoo of the symbol pi, that is the Greek letter P on her foot. This seems a bit cringy to me. I think this is probably an example of kind of nerd identity. As I understand it, many, if not most, people who get tattoos get them for reasons of identity. They somehow identify with the thing that they are getting tattooed. May well be that they have vastly different opinions about this topic, but I honestly don't have a consumer identity. I don't feel any feel that the kinds of media that I consume or any other kind of products that I consume, whether they be electronics, entertainment, even hobbies. You know, some people identify themselves as gamers as a primary personal identity. I don't. I think that's frankly bizarre. As I understand it, that kind of reasons are generally the reason to get tattoos. And of course, since I don't really appreciate consumer identities, I'm not that positive towards a lot of these nerd culture tattoos either. I once worked as a salesman at a mobile phone store, and I met a person who bragged about having been a an Apple customer longer than I had lived, which was certainly possible. He seemed middle aged. I was in my early 20s at the time. However, what I did not understand then, and I frankly do not understand now either, is why would you be proud of who you buy your telephone from? That's not something that I understand at a fundamental level. Once we get, now that we have got into identities, I think it's an interesting topic in itself. Um, as I recall, a large part of my audience are Americans, and I have seen some Americans online talk about their experiences in some kind of college courses or university courses, as Europeans might know them. And I remember someone mentioning that a Chinese exchange student had they had some kind of an exercise where they had to um, explicate their identities. So list, let's say, three things that they think that they are. And there had been a Chinese exchange student who had said that as his first item of identity that he was Chinese. Seemed perfectly normal to me. I would also identify myself if I was asked to describe myself. I would start with my ethnicity, which in my case is, of course, also my country of origin. So that is somewhat unproblematic point of identity. And as someone who lives abroad, uh, one of the first questions that strangers that I meet posit to me is actually, where are you from? This is, of course, as a foreigner, I have a distinct accent in my way of speaking the local language, which is not my native language. So some sort of foreign origin will be relatively obvious. However, that was not the interesting part. The interesting part was that the American mentioned that he would never have thought of ethnicity as a point of identity, which is somewhat bizarre to me as an old worlder. I wonder what these. I don't remember if this person said what they identified as. That would be an interesting question in itself. Would they have a class identity? Perhaps, perhaps not. Perhaps they would have had a. I think students are unlikely to have professional identities. I myself would secondarily identify by my profession, as it is something that I enjoy. And the topics that it concerns are topics that I think of on my free time as well. I imagine, for example, a janitor might not be as keen to identify with their occupation, particularly if they did not enjoy being a janitor. When I was younger, I think I did actually have a sort of a hobby identity. I was into strength sports, so imagine powerlifting, that kind of thing. Actually, powerlifting was the strength sport that I engaged in. So if you imagined powerlifting, you were entirely correct. But of course, strength sports encompass other sports as well. Olympic weightlifting, strongman competitions. I think the sport that is engaged in at strongman competitions doesn't really have a non-awkward name. I think it's mostly just called strongman or strongman sports. However, that is something that has fallen away as I have become older, graduated. I don't really have the social circumstances to dedicate an awful lot of time to sports of any sort anymore. And of course, I actually had an injury not related to the sport itself, but one that kept me from engaging in the sport for a while. Took a year for my rotator cuff to heal when it was torn. as a simple accident. I fell down in the winter and fell on my armpit, actually. So just soft tissue damage, but unfortunately it took a while for that soft tissue damage to heal more or less. Oh, anyway, I think class identities are quite weak, if not non-existent, in the US. So this, I don't think the American I was talking about earlier would have been likely to identify by social class. They seem to view identifying by their ethnicity utterly alien for some reason. So the question becomes, what else can you identify as if your profession, social class, ethnicity are off the table? As I understand it, this kind of consumer identities, although I think they do exist in the old world as well, my understanding is that they are more prominent in the US, and I think that this kind of void of identity might well have something to do with the phenomenon. This is a very tenderness foot. This is the second to last foot as well, or the second to last feet. I imagine I will be able to throw both of them during this um, remaining 4 minutes. So if anyone in the audience thoroughly enjoys feet, now is the time to pray, as the collection of images that these models are pulled out of includes both men and women. So in 3.5 minutes, you will either see some gnarly old man feet or maybe some cute young lady feet, whichever it is, I don't know. It doesn't really affect me, as I am more preoccupied with the actual drawing than thinking about the feet in any or the people in any way. I've heard some perhaps sociological commentaries talking about how professional identities can be dangerously fragile, particularly if the profession is one that is threatened by some sort of wider societal developments. So, for example, thinking about the US as this person whose identity I cannot remember. If they, I think they struggled with identifying as anything, which of course would support my hypothesis of America being a hotbed of um, the destruction of identity. Um, for jobs, for example, at least in Europe, laborer identities, so identifying overlappingly with both their social class and actual work, has historically been quite strong, but this has been weakening for a while now. Um, one kind of laborer that is entirely whose profession and of course therefore their identity, if they only identify with their job, are miners, particularly coal miners. I think there is a movement away from coal power all around the world, partly, of course, for environmental reasons, but at least in some areas it will be because the high quality coal reserves have just been exhausted. I think this is the case in Germany, for example, that parts of Germany that used to be large coal producers simply cannot do it anymore because there is no more coal or high quality coal to be got out of the earth. 10 minutes, these are hairy feet, I imagine male. And then what happens when you are a coal miner through and through? If that is the only thing you identify as and you can no longer mine coal, what happens to you? What happens to your self sense of worth? As I understand it, these kinds of weakening labor communities in the US are a hotbed of political radicalism. The consequence of that. And I imagine that the political radicalism might partially just be them looking for any political candidates that would have their have their back, keep their job still existing. However, I imagine that that a part of the phenomenon is feeling devalued as well. If they think that coal miner is what they are deep down, and coal mining is no longer desired, I could easily see these people feeling that they, as people, are not desired. Whether or not they actually are devalued, I can't say. I'm not an American, but I imagine that as poor laborers in a country with extremely low labor organization, they probably don't have a lot of say in society. I'm not really satisfied with this one. It seems to be going badly. What the earlier ones were, felt were easier and more fun to draw. But let's do our best. Perhaps this pose will be helpful for me to work through as an anatomy exercise in a few minutes. And in any case, I'll have plenty of time to work on this. Let's try to finish it in some way, and then have a have another look at it with plenty of time. The angles of the lower legs are somewhat different. The knees, I don't think will be quite touching for this model. There's a nail. So if we think about what kinds of identities might be more stable, then less likely to become under attack somehow. You might think of ethnicity, the classical identity, some form of ethnic identity is certainly documented all the way to antiquity. The famous one is relayed by Herodotus, the half Lydian, I think, historian of the ancient Greece. So he was not actually, both his parents were not Greek, and as a result, he was never quite at home in the Greek world. He was quite active in the Greek colonies in southern Italy. But what I wanted to talk about was a story that he relays from the past in his time. Whether or not or how true the story is, we cannot know. But supposedly, at the time of the Persian Wars, which, if you are not particularly familiar with, you might think of some action movies, such as the Bush era propaganda piece 300, a somewhat inventive film, and of course, I imagine most of the propagandistic overtones come from the comic as well. Uh, 300 is actually quite innovative in its propaganda, both in that, particularly in the movie, there are some Bush era American right wing catchphrases. Freedom isn't free, for example. But also in the way that it functions as propaganda in both the in narrative and out of the narrative. The use of these Bush era slogans seems, on the face of it, to be trivially a case of justifying the wars in the colonies that were going on at the time, supporting an anti-Middle Eastern sentiment in the homeland, that kind of thing. But of course, as we find at the very end of the film, the story has been relayed for Greek soldiers by uh, their fellow countrymen, trying to psych them up for an upcoming battle against the Persians. So all of this the framing of the Persians as a kind of generic action movie villains to be slaughtered en masse is cleverly, of course, both serves a purpose for to have an effect on the audience, but it also fits the narrative of the film itself. This is usually brought up by people uh, want to deny the current, or at the time current, political message in the film. It doesn't really affect that. The This kind of argument is facile on the face of it. On For one reason, of course, because any any film that is not laughably propagandistic has to have its message supported and integrated into the story and structure of the story. So unless we are talking about something extremely cringy, such as Reefer Madness, for example, a famous anti-cannabis film from the 1960s, I think, there will be there will have to be an in-universe um, justification for the propagandistic elements. Let's think about huge zoos, for example. It's getting a bit into Jap territory, but Pech gehabt, mein Freund. Das ist kein Traum und endet nie, as they say. The Zeus, who is the titular character of the film, but under no circumstances its hero, is of course the villain in the film. This movie is vaguely based on historical accounts, and he is of course a villain in these accounts as well. Whether or not he was a villain in reality is another question altogether. So now we have finished the entire class. However, the fact that Mr. Seuss is a villain in the story is not coincidental to the larger societal themes and messages that Jude Seuss wanted to communicate to its audience. Ah, hello, Luroxin. So if you haven't drawn anything in years, I imagine you did draw at some point. Did you enjoy it? Was it something that you'd like to get back to? Since you're watching me draw, I imagine you either like watching drawing, enjoy my voice, or perhaps you do have some remaining interest in these kinds of returning to drawing. I myself have had several pauses in my so-called art career where I might not have uh, drawn anything or practically anything in years before having some kind of a comeback once again. And of course, you are entirely correct that consumer identity is something that does uh, benefit the people who are selling the products that they want you to identify with. Highly stylized or non-representational. Have you heard about automatic drawing? Or I can't. I'm not quite sure what it is called. It's kind of thing where you. Well, I'm going to use this layer for it. You just you just start drawing something, and then at some point, um, you just draw at anything that comes to mind. And for some people, they are actually able to integrate these kind of things into actual drawings. I myself like to draw decorative patterns, for example. Uh, I enjoy I enjoy the mechanical aspect of drawing to an extent. For example, when I'm waiting for something at work, for example, I might draw these kinds of cross hatching patterns. And then start making a grid out of them. It's particularly fun when using certain kinds of felt pens. Ah, patterns. I think I end up producing the patterns intentionally, although I don't start out with the idea of making them, but I often end up um, thinking that something looks, for example, might look like I end up thinking that the end result looks like something, and then I will add elements that would complete the idea. Sometimes I like to start out drawing the kinds of large items and then filling the gaps with smaller items or drawing spirals. And then at some point I will usually color them in. As you might have noticed me moving from kind of sketchy small lines into this kind of confident, slow, almost uninterested line work. That might actually have some positive effects on, um, the fine motor skills or the kind of confidence to draw, much like drawing with an actual pencil and paper. I once noticed gave me the or increased my ability to draw extremely aggressively, which is helpful when you want to actually draw something instead of spending forever um, working through everything slowly and deliberately. Overlapping curved lines. I wonder if this kind of thing, so something like this. Um, I think I when I automatically draw something like this, I think I usually end up making them fans like this, or I think maybe a claw could be another way to describe this. Turning them into three-dimensional um, objects might be good as an exercise as well, although that's not something that comes to me naturally as when I'm just doodling to pass time. Well, anyway, let's move towards anatomy. So, what do we have in a foot? Well, we have the bones. Here's the outside bone. Calligraphy was actually something that I dabbled in slightly as a high schooler. I think I might have got a bad pen. I had a fountain pen, so it had these cartridges that you put into it instead of using an ink bottle, for example. It never really worked well in my experience. It might be that it was simply a low quality product. Ah, pardon me, I misidentified the end of this bone. Of course, this knob here is the end of the bone. So here we can deduce that it is in fact the outer bone that is the longer of the two bones. This one is somewhat curved. I'm not quite sure if we would be able to see the curve in this breath, but I'm going to draw it curving a little bit in any case. the so it comes on the inside. However, it starts in the middle, so it ends up having a curve like this. It comes up to the knee. And the outer bone is just on this side, and as we can see on the sketch, it comes down lower. And then, of course, this bone will be higher up, perhaps somewhere around here, on the other foot. And this time it will curve something like this. You have a particular subset of calligraphy that you are most interested in? Would this be something like 18th century calligraphy with extremely thin lines, the kind of flowing style with a lot of loops, or perhaps Fraktur, kind of Central European or Northern European block script? I think both of those can be quite aesthetic, uh, although both of them can be difficult to read. So here I am drawing kind of, half of a puck again, very similarly to the way that um, I did for the raised bones last time. So here the shorter bone comes up to the upper side of this puck, and the longer one comes to the halfway point of the puck, so the end of this half. Poofy. Are those the ones where the calligraphy ends up looking like an animal, for example? If yes, then I agree. Those are quite nice. Other than that, I am not particularly familiar with Arabic calligraphy, although I imagine that there is quite a rich tradition of it, since many Arabic and many branches of Islam frown upon art depicting humans, geometric and block-like. Um, I wonder if I can think of any examples. Not necessarily. But of course, the kind of geometric patterns in North African and I imagine Middle Eastern architecture in general are something that I quite enjoy. Here I have not drawn these sufficiently different, the angles sufficiently different from each other. I think actually both of them are slightly wrong. I think both of them are pointed a little bit too much towards the center line, whereas both of them should be somewhat more extreme. So let's try doing that now. So I'm trying to make this puck more or less perpendicular to the camera, with the idea that this foot is perpendicular to the camera as well. Japanese and Chinese and Japanese calligraphy too dry. I I think I can see what you mean. They they seem to be more focused on the letter forms than the end result of the entire artistic endeavor. That's, that angle isn't quite right either. Let's just decide that the angle is going to be this. Uh, I might have made some mistakes here with the ankle or that make it necessarily incongruent with the actual actually existing drawing. Here I think that I have again made something a little bit too broad. This is starting to look better. I think I can be more or less satisfied with this one. Here we see that what actually helped me get this better, perhaps not correct, but more comfortable for me, was using this endpoint here as a bounding point to make sure that the puck is not too broad towards the camera. So now we start getting into the structures of the foot itself. I'm going to halve this one. This can't be right. I'm going to focus on the back foot first. I think I think I started more successfully on that one. So you have a bit of a sort of a bone spur backwards. Hmm. I think I have forgotten quite a lot about the foot, unfortunately. I was confident that I could get into this without much trouble, but it seems like I'm going to have to fight my way through this. Well, let's draw a bit of an outline of what the finished foot is supposed to look like, and then we can think about what kind of components need to be there to accomplish this kind of profile. Hmm. I'm lost in thought because there's actually, I know an artist whose sketches are, in my opinion, much better than their finished work, exactly because of that sort of, elan of just doing it instead of working on it instead of consciously working on it. I can't remember who I am thinking of, unfortunately. Hmm. It might well be that we want the puck to be relatively centered. I think the angle here is not quite correct. It is something like this, perhaps. I think we probably want the puck to be relatively centered in the back of the foot, but then we do need some extra mass there. There's a relatively large bony knob on the back of the foot. So actually, let's just add one here and let's see what happens. I'm going to make the gesture drawing almost invisible. It feels like it's distracting me more than it's actually helping me here. So we have to have some mass towards the back, and we do have to have some mass towards the side. Although I don't think quite that much. So seen from the side, what I am thinking of is something like this. Sort of almost like a high heel structure. Actually, let's try adding this triangle to the bottom of the puck. That might be helpful. Although I will still have to find some way of adding mass to the sides of this thing. So what do we actually have here? I'm not going to merge anything while the opacity is changed. It's going to be a bad idea. They are going to merge with that opacity and take that opacity as their maximum opacity. I think that's not something that I want to happen. I want it to be something like this. I think this is longer towards the back and broader than the actual structure here, than the puck. Let's take it at the halfway point here. I have to wonder if this kind of experimental anatomy is more or less interesting than the usual one. Although it appears that the amount of viewers is somewhat lower than last time. Might be that anatomy isn't actually that interesting for the audience. Although for those who are watching, worry not. That does not mean that I would stop having anatomy streams. As someone who actually enjoys their job, I have little to no plans of trying to be commercially or in any other quantifiable way successful with streaming. So as long as there is enough of an audience for me to feel that it's worthwhile, I am going to keep doing just what I want to do. And in any case, if there are a few people around, that just means that that I can freely talk about my plans for future streams without actually spoiling it for anyone. Namely, I've been thinking about having a sort of large project art stream, a series of art streams. I think where I would start an illustration from zero, go through all of the pre-planning, brainstorming things at the start, and then work my way up from that. and then include all kinds of things. Thinking how to think about perspective, maybe using some of the perspective tools in Krita, drawing from imagination. I don't think I've done that on stream at any point. There might be something to that that would be more interesting in another way than the gesture streams are. Editing is something that I'm not particularly interested in, particularly since I guess a time lapse with it would actually be a lot of effort, and effort is something that I'm quite averse to when it comes to my hobbies. I think that I get enough effort at work. Anyway, so drawing from imagination, uh, starting with bounding boxes, having a sort of a rough sketch to begin with, and after that, drawing in the skeleton, the muscles, clothes, um, having a textile, hanging draped textile in the background. This would be actually an art class, uh, you know, scene, and then maybe some color work and things like that. I think the problem would be that if I wanted to make a compilation, I would probably have to actually redo the voiceover entirely. So just use the video and then maybe time lapse back and forth, make some have an actual narration to it instead of this kind of meandering storyline that naturally comes up. No, the angle there is wrong. It should actually be up here that that it crests the hill, I think. Something like this. Maybe even later. Good enough. It seems like it flares out too much. I just want to turn off the gesture drawing back there. Probably doing more harm than good. So that has flared out a bit. Actually, it should flare towards the back a bit. And it's quite difficult. I'll actually have to, well, if not nothing else, this has been a reminder for me to actually refresh on my feet anatomy, as it obviously isn't quite as fresh on my mind as I have thought. Still doesn't look good at all here on the side. I think it has to what I am thinking of is correct, but the way that I am doing it is somehow fundamentally wrong. So one, I want it to flare down. Thumbnail needs to happen. It also needs to flare out, is the problem. Out and back. Let's start here. Out and back. So we have it flaring out. Angles might not be quite correct, but well enough. It is now flaring out, but not yet really down. Hmm. I think I've talked about working on drawing elementary items at some point. This is exactly the kind of thing where it comes in handy. Being able to draw volume is basically the easiest when you start with cubes and cylinders and that kind of elementary component. Anyway, I'm going to take a break from the ankle and move towards the front of the foot here. Again, I don't think it is broad enough here. But let's start drawing in the bones. These actually do start further back somewhere around here. However, for art use, it's doesn't really come that useful to draw the entire thing, since they don't actually articulate within the foot at all. I don't think the bones of the palm can actually articulate a little bit. You can the palm isn't necessarily just straight. It can you can particularly move the first and fourth digits inside here. I think the second and fifth. I think the third and fourth remain more or less fixed. Hmm. Take a look at this once again. So that blue line here is about the actual length of the towards the end of the toes. We are going to end up with the big toe again, much like in the hand, has two primarily articulating bones. One of these is the one that turns up, and one is the one that turns down. And actually, where the ball of the foot is around here. So, like with the meat, that when you think about the hands, you had the palm, then you have the fingers, which are as of their bones are about the same length, divided like this. So you have 1, 1, 2, 4. However, the meat comes down like this. This is the same case in the feet as well. So the actual point of articulation is much further back than the meat is. So the meat comes down something like this. The point of actual articulation is again further back than where to the meat extends. Then again, like in the hands, the toes have the most of the other toes have three articulating pieces again and again. The point at which the foot actually turns is way back here, and the meat extends towards here. So the part of the toes that are actually identifiable above the meat don't seem that dramatically different in length. You might, if you just look at them from the outside, you might think that the three components are the same length. However, they are not. The last and the second to last are more or less the same length. The first one is about double the length, but again is about half covered in meat. The way that I have drawn things here is based on this classical ideal foot, which has a longest second digit. So that is the I don't actually know if that has a particular name in English. Let's just call it the second toe. So the classical ideal proportions is that the second toe is the longest and that the big toe is shorter than that. However, that is of course not necessarily the case. Can be the case. That is the case for me. But the last time that I was actually at a beach and I saw the feet of some of my friends, it turns out that I was the only one who actually has this configuration. For all of the other ones, it wasn't like this. It was like this. So the first digit was actually the longest. I have seen some, vernacular publications assigning countries to these, like Roman feet, Greek feet, Egyptian feet. I don't think that has either a population anatomical basis or an actual historical basis. I don't think the ancient Mediterraneans had this kind of idea or this kind of stereotype about their countries. I'm not an expert on the topic, so it might be actually the case. So, back to my nemesis. What if I just, you know, just try drawing it anyway? It certainly looks better, but I've actually found it helpful for you to actually draw a foot that gets you the correct proportions. Probably not that helpful. Mm. It might be that the difference in thickness between the puck and the rest of the foot is actually smaller than I had remembered, because this honestly this looks pretty good to me at this point, bizarrely enough. So I'm going to try to ink this a little bit, so to say, and then I'm going to move on into the meat of the foot, of which there is very little. know, I'm just going to extend the puck to the outside and pretend that this is all perfectly fine. That's certainly going to make it conceptually easier on me. And let's see if it ends up looking good. Actually, the core of the problem might have been that all along. I would certainly be happy if it had been. I mean, yeah, we don't actually have to change an awful lot in the bones here, make this all fit more or less. As I recall, the actual bones start here. So I'm going to make a slight change here. I'm going to make them start at this point instead of making this dip down and then moving towards the toe bones or the foot bone, inner foot bones. Oh, now we have two spammers at the same time. Unusual. Uh, how do I block these? Here we have Ben. I wonder what kind of a process led to two of them appearing at the same time. Is it just a funny coincidence, or perhaps the algorithm had some sort of a slight hiccup? Or I'm going to divide this a little bit. You know, after all of this fighting against the bones, I think this is. I can't say I'm particularly happy with this. I did have to work an awful lot for this, and it's honestly not that good. But I think it more or less worked. This is kind of all right. So, what kind of meat do we actually have in the foot? Well, we again have this. No, this is all still almost black. Black. I want it to be red. That extends towards the first half of the um, first toe bones here. And this one has a quite a strong fat pad on its underside. So if you look at feet, they have the toes, and they have this bulge behind the toes. Uh, that's this one. It's actually also quite thick. Can even be as can even be as long as the as the toes forwards of its arm. So it's one of those things that you can actually look at on yourself if you just use your fingers as calipers. However, something that I neglected here. Of course, this has to be curved as well. So if we were to look at this from the bottom side, we would have a long running pad like this. Then along the outside rim, you have another fat pad. This is actually, both of these are quite comparable with the fat pads on the hand. On the outside, you have another one. This is comparable to the edge of the hand. You can remember that the palm also had these fat pads. Where the palm has muscles is in the thumb. However, there isn't really a thumb to be found in that sense on the foot. The big toe doesn't really have any particular powers of articulation to it. It can certainly articulate itself more strongly than the other single toes can, but the range of motion isn't that much bigger. The let's say it's more autonomous, but it's not really uh, more capable. So there ends up being a third fat patch at the uh, what's the opposite of the ball of the foot? The ball is this one. What's the one at the back? Can't remember. But there's another fat pad there. So you end up with a contour line that goes something like this. You have more mass on the, seemingly more mass on the outside, and then you have less mass on the inside. And if you have, for example, shoe soles, they are going to have form something like this. And then, of course, in addition, you have the fat pads on the toes. This is again extremely comparable uh, to the hands. Although in the toes, the last bones have much more prominent fat pads than the previous ones. So if you want to, you can just only draw those ones. That's probably enough for now. Not necessarily a particularly good job teaching foot anatomy, but not much we can do about that. It's been a bit more than an hour. I'm going to take a little bit of a look at architecture as planned. Probably not going to do as long as of a session that than as I originally had in mind. But this is another case where drawing in elementary shapes will help you out quite a lot. I have an image of the Caractère de Chevalier pulled up, and I am going to sort of gesture draw the castle. This is where having a sort of a grate, you can sort of draw a grate, something that you can, if you don't want to use any modern equipment, I am going to, there you can use this kind of cross method to find middle points in the drawing. So you can actually, if you have an extremely stable hand, this does not appear to have been the case for me, you can actually separate things into fourths like this, and then of course eighths. Although of course I have to say that I would recommend just using the tools for this. In any case, the Croix du Chevalier has a couple of main structures to it. And I'm going to start by drawing in the rough form of these structures. The actual castle probably isn't quite as symmetric, but I am going to draw it as probably more symmetric than it actually is. Before nothing else, then just to make things easier for me, and I imagine somewhat easier for you to follow as well. So the outside wall has an outline something like this. Then there are some inside constructions as well. I'm going to switch to red for. You see, the thing is that they are not concentric. There's a slight angle between them. The inner fortification ends up sitting in a bounding box, something like this. And of course, again, it is not actually this square. So I'm going to cut away a part of it. Now I'm left with more or less a rhomboid. Well, my geometry vocabulary in English is not perfect. And then there are three interesting towers in this inner structure. They are again set at not quite right angles to the rest of the structure. Interestingly, the towers at the back here, they are sort of pointed towards each other, not away from each other, as you might imagine. Towers usually would be pointed. So with these two layers, we have a vague idea of what goes where, and then we can start building things up. This is a castle, of course, so the walls have a certain height. There's actually a bit of a bastion here. I'm going to draw it in at this point. It's not necessarily the most smart way to go about things, but again, if you actually want high quality art education, I suggest going to an art class. The people there teaching will hopefully have both the artistic and the educational chops to actually be massively helpful to you. I'm not particularly good at art, and I do not have any pedagogical competence. So if I do somehow manage to actually help you, it is probably going to be mostly a coincidence. Now then, the last section here again has some towers. I'm going to actually draw them in. Funnily enough, this wall segment runs into one of the towers. So you end up with something like this. But I think this has ended up being far too high. And as seen from the top, we can actually see the curve in this wall that we cannot see at the bottom. Here again, we get a curve that we cannot see at the bottom because it is obscured behind the last component. Here we can see that actually completing the cylinder here would have been better than jumping straight to the top. Fortunately, racing is particularly easy with computer graphics. I find it actually relatively difficult to do a good job at with traditional media, but luckily for now, I am not using traditional media. There are some things behind here, but in the interest of actually finishing something today, I am going to skip most of this. All right, that seems fine to me. Then we need to uh, hmm, we have to lift this up an awful lot more because the earth level of the inner castle is something like this. And of course, the actual castle parts have to climb out of the pit much more than this so that they will be prominent. I'm going to actually lift the entire sketch first. Let's see how that turns out. So at this point, we have to lift the fortification itself by a certain amount. I think I'm going to actually again start a new layer for it. Just almost hide the previous one. So at this point, we want to lift this one relatively noticeably. And of course, it is going to have a bit of prominence at the outside here. and then recesses into the wall segment. The wall segment actually curves a little bit or turns. It's more of a break line than a curve, but it has a certain structure to it. Then we move further away. We have our first bastion here. And the bastion is slightly higher than the rest of the wall as well, as is this tower. Let's actually draw in the entire tower at this point. We can actually see part of the back of this building. Very nice. And then let's keep moving on the outside. There is again a rounded bastion. No, there is not. That is a part of the outside wall that I decided not to draw in. Right. So we are going to take a straight line to the corner here. And at that point, we have the rounded bastion here. Draw that in. And then we start getting towards the main structures here. They actually have a rounded outside, so let's add that in and then start lifting. The other one has a rounded front as well. We have to lift from the rounded front and the corner that is visible to us. We end up with something like this. Something like this. And then there is, of course, a wall segment from the rounded bastion to the front part of this castle. However, it is not quite as high as this castle. So we draw it something more like this. There is a low wall segment or raised terrace between the two larger towers here. So we can draw that in. Where did I start? There's one further bastion here I want to add in. And this is another high one. This one starts, the wall of course starts at the bottom here. That's easy. And it starts at the ground level, a little bit behind the corner here. So this is what we are going to draw. And then we have an easier time just winging where it ends up being. You can just lift the point and lift the point and draw a collinear line with the original one. So we have a very simple block model of the character Chevalier, not a particularly beautiful one, but I'm honestly running out of steam here, particularly after the feet section. So I'm going to try some speed shading, outline it with the chalk, and then just try to shade it a little bit. And by the end, that point, I think I'm done for today. So there's a bit of a parapet of a walking surface on the inside here. Try to suggest that with a bit of gray here. Maybe weaker on the sides where it's obfuscated by the wall. And then a bit of shading on the outer walls. Let's say that the sun is going to be on this side. Oh no, actually not. It's going to put the sun on this side. So which facets are going to be in the light? This one, so it's quite light. This one is quite light. This one is again quite light, as is this one. However, this one is starting to be quite dark. It is facing clearly away from the sun. This one might get a little bit more light through diffusion. It's still not facing the sun, but it's also not quite away from it. Same applies to a lot of these perpendicular walls here. At this point, I'm mostly using the strokes to suggest the curvature. And this could be done with this shading as well, but my confidence in my ability to shade that in is relatively low at this point. So now we are again faced with the question of shading. Which which faces are facing the sun? I think these two will be the brightest ones. Will be slightly less so. The part of this face that is not behind the wall will be bright, but the part that is behind the wall will be relatively dark. This one is facing almost straight away. This is not quite as bad, but still dark. That is about the same as this one. And this one. Parts of this wall are well lit, as are this wall. This one, I think most of this. This isn't really dark either. For the most part, this is not either. At the front here, it's going to have the shadow from the actual building. What else do we have here? We have the top planes. Make them perhaps a bit darker than they should be, but I want to use the contours once again to suggest that they have some directionality to them. So at this point, I have to move on to the soil. At this point, I am actually going to use a color. I recently was at a museum exhibit that had some illustrations that had a quite nice aesthetic to them. There were ink drawings that had particular points of interest colored in. I thought that was quite both aesthetically pleasing and, of course, for the pedagogic purpose, having the most interesting part of the picture in color, in contrast to the rest of it in grayscale, is, of course, quite nice. Here I had started to draw on top of the suggested carpets, which is something you would want to do. An easy solution to that would be just to use separate layers, but I've been burnt out on this session for a while now. The fiasco with the feet anatomy had a deleterious effect on my morale. However, I imagine that actively thinking about the topic was, in fact, quite helpful and would help me draw feet in the future. That's a mentality that is good to cultivate, particularly if you don't have it from nature. I think for a lot of hobby artists, the fantasy is to just draw and have something fun and amazing, something to show around, something to illustrate the fun idea that you had, uh, almost without effort. It's of course not realistic unless you have already been for example, a professional illustrator for decades, or if you are the kind of grandpa who has been taking art classes for, let's say, 50 years, at that point you will be able to just draw in exactly what you want. However, by that point, you don't really, hmm, how to put it? It's a fantasy that when you can um, fulfill it, you no longer need or want it. I think it's something like being an adult for children. Um, Children and teenagers want to be adults as quickly as they can, but unfortunately, when they become adults, they often find that it actually wasn't as fun as they thought it would be. Luckily, this is not really the case for me. I think that my adult life is certainly one of the best, if not the actual best time of my life. I never really enjoyed going to school, for example. I thought that school was extremely boring. Wasn't really challenged in the schooling system that I went to. And besides, now I have money that I never did as a child. Unfortunately, I also have a sort of internal understanding of I'm accustomed to being poor. So actually, since a few years now, I have had 10 times the monthly income that I had for the few years before that. But I haven't really done that much with the money. I've done a lot of saving actually. I don't really have that expensive tastes, and when I do, I have an internalized feeling of, shouldn't I be using this money for something more intelligent? And as a result, I end up not having holidays in faraway countries every single year, like some people do. Shade a little bit behind the rabbits here, behind the castle here. And then let's say that the courtyard here has a different kind of sand on it, so it is lighter naturally. And then we might want to shade behind these buildings. All right. We are coming up to 2 hours. That's probably a pretty good time. Let's cut the recording. Thank you for to everyone watching on YouTube afterwards. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. I hope I have learned something, particularly about feet. And have a good